Have you ever played a game on the hardest difficulty? That was President Joe Biden's task in keeping the economy strong while the Federal Reserve rapidly raised interest rates, not only at the fastest pace in 40 years, but also the highest level in 15 years, pushing it from near zero to over 5%. Sensibly, most economists predicted a recession, but remarkably, by the late 2024, not only had Biden avoided a recession, he had brought inflation down from a peak of 9.1 to 3% by the end of his term. And he also had wage growth right beneath that of inflation, with strong unemployment and a record number of new business applications. Bills like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act were the reason we were able to combat this inflation down to 3% while sustaining such high interest rates without entering a recession. Not only was it the first large-scale federal infrastructure bill in over a decade, it was bipartisan, and something neither Obama or Trump could get through during their terms. It was a $1.2 trillion investment in America. It broke down to about $550 billion in new spending and $650 billion in reauthorized routine spending for projects like bridge repairs, highway expansions, port upgrades, lead pipe replacements, and public transport modernization. America's infrastructure, the hallmark of a developed society, had been crumbling with the decades of maintenance being deferred, and it had earned a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers, meaning it was mediocre, not fully meeting the demands. While fixing America's infrastructure, it also created 1.5 million jobs in construction and manufacturing, strengthening our middle class, the foundation of our economy, while building, repairing, or upgrading our roads, bridges, and power grids. Furthermore, not only do we get a better nation, but it's estimated every $1 of spending will get $3.60 back in economic benefits, with some studies showing higher. Let's take a second to realize how insane that is. Not only did we all get this infrastructure improvement, we improved the economy 3 to 4 times, its policy executed with precision. His next bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, was combining national security, high-wage job growth, U.S. manufacturing, and scientific advancement. It was in response to the dynamic computing market and a more clear picture that future scientific advancement and national security will be fueled by things like AI. This $39 billion investment in the semiconductor manufacturing research space, plus a $24 billion in tax credits for chip plants, and it also reauthorized $200 billion in scientific research and development for AI, quantum computing, clean energy, and biotechnology. The reason this is so important is because the U.S. didn't have any of the top 5 semiconductor manufacturers on U.S. soil, with the leaders being Taiwan and China. But as of late 2024, and due to this bill, over 70 new chip fabrication plants were in construction or planning in the U.S. The investment in domestic chip production will increase national security by reducing advanced chip dependency on foreign adversaries. But, like with the Infrastructure Act, it will also create 93,000 temporary construction jobs, 43,000 jobs for the factory operations, and indirectly 240,000 permanent jobs due to these factories opening, bringing back manufacturing to the U.S. in a vital way. My question, though, is why didn't he try tariffs? His last massive economic act was the Inflation Reduction Act, but it was 3 pieces of legislation into one huge bill: climate, health, and tax reform. From a climate perspective, it was the largest investment in clean energy in the history of the U.S., with roughly $370 billion in incentives and funding to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and support domestic clean tech manufacturing. This included $33 billion for green public transport, $27 billion in the investment in clean energy companies, and $2.6 billion to conserve coastal habitat. The future is green, and this investment is in an area that has lagged behind traditional funding, with this funding to drive long-term sustainable growth. I won't go into it too much into the healthcare cost reductions, as we have a video on this and everything else he did on healthcare, but the Inflation Reduction Act finally empowered Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices for the first time in 20 years, providing $100 billion in savings over 10 years, capping insulin for Medicare at $35 per month. Moving on, the last part of the Inflation Reduction Act was focusing on taxing corporations and the super rich. Think of it as the opposite of Trump's big, beautiful bill. Put a 15% minimum tax on corporations with over $1 billion in profits, closing loopholes billionaire companies love to exploit. He also provisioned a 1% tax on stock buybacks, as an economy wants you to reinvest in innovation and its workers over a stock buyback. Both the 15% minimum tax and the 1% buyback tax earned the U.S. $300 billion over a decade. It also continues the limit on excess business losses over $289,000. This means wealthy people can no longer start their own company and get a tax credit for their hobby, such as losing $1 million on racing horses, but they won't care because they get a tax write-off. With the IRA, this is no longer available, and it earns $53 billion in taxes over a decade, which equates to the equivalent of 86% of all Doge savings without cutting vital programs like cancer funding. However, the IRS is so underfunded, the rich can often get away with it, which is why my favorite part of all this is the increased funding for the IRS by $80 billion over a decade, including the modernization of the IRS systems and hiring up to 87,000 new IRS employees. However, it's notable that even though we're hiring 87,000 new IRS employees, it's expected that 50,000 of the current employees will retire over a 5-year period. And look, I hate taxes as much as you, but there are certain certainties in life: death and taxes. Despite Republican rhetoric that taxation is theft, taxes are the foundation of how we function as a society. It's the reality of a civilized nation, and this IRS funding increase matters significantly because historically, the poor have been easier targets for audits. They have fewer assets or complex income streams, making it easier and cheaper for the IRS to audit the poor. Conversely, wealthy individuals earning millions have multiple streams of incomes, complex holdings, varied classifications, and financial resources to fight the IRS audit aggressively. Even if wealthy individuals don't necessarily win the case, the IRS has limited resources, making it difficult and expensive to pursue them. President Biden explicitly directed the IRS to shift their enforcement focus towards high-income earners, particularly millionaires who haven't been filing taxes. And thanks to this targeted focus and significant modernization efforts, the IRS collected $172 million within just 6 months from 26,000 millionaires who previously weren't just filing their taxes, and another $100 million from those who did file but just didn't pay. Think about that. We're so scared of taxation, we don't realize we were the ones getting screwed, and the IRS is so starved for cash, they were unable to do this simple service before, which is why this investment was so critical. The only problem is that we have already had to scale back the investment to appease Republicans and get funding through the debt ceiling, with $21 billion being clawed back. On the minimum wage, President Biden pushed hard for Congress to raise the federal minimum wage, which was stuck at $7.25 since 2009. When that failed due to Senate opposition, he used executive authority to do what he could. Since he could not directly increase the federal employee minimum wage, he signed an executive order to raise the minimum wage for federal contract employees, meaning if you did business with the U.S. government, you had to pay all of your employees $15 an hour. That was up from $10.95, and it would rise with inflation and did not allow for the tip workers exclusion or disabled worker exclusion. Biden also directed the Office of Personnel Management to ensure the federal government employees earn at least $15 an hour. By early 2022, about 70,000 lower-paid federal workers got a pay raise to $15 an hour thanks to this order. He also took steps for middle-class pay, updating overtime rules. The Department of Labor issued a rule to expand overtime pay eligibility to 1 million more salaried workers by raising the salary cutoff for overtime exemption from about $35,500 to $58,000 per year. This means any full-time employee making under $58,000 would be guaranteed time and a half pay if they worked over 40 hours a week. The threshold would also auto-update every 3 years just to keep pace with wage growth. Somewhat predictably, business groups in Republican-led states sued to block the rule. In late 2024, a Trump-appointed federal judge in Texas struck down the overtime expansion before it could take effect. Biden's Department of Labor was fighting the decision on appeal as the term ended and Trump was elected president. Since then, Trump decided to no longer take up the appeal. Biden also strengthened union and workers' rights. He rescinded several of Trump's executive orders that had limited collective bargaining rights for federal employees, restricted union representative access and use of official time, moves critics labeled as union busting. Biden also appointed a union-friendly majority to the National Labor Relationship Board, which has since implemented more worker-friendly rulings, for example, making it harder for employers to illegally fire workers for organizing and easing the path to union election. These efforts coincided with the resurgence of labor activism nationally, from Amazon warehouse workers unionizing to auto workers striking for better contracts. Using federal procurement powers, Biden also signed, in 2022, the Project Labor Agreement on large federal construction projects over $35 million. PLAs are pre-hire collective agreements that set wage rates and work rules for big projects, ensuring no strikes or lockouts. By mandating these PLAs on major federal builds, the administration both ensures timely and quality construction and supports good union jobs. Additionally, the administration instituted policies to prioritize federal grants and loans for projects with high labor standards. For instance, energy projects get bigger tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act if they pay prevailing wages and use apprentices. The result is a strong incentive for companies to pay workers well, train workers, and helping the impact of the federal investment. He also had Lino Khan as FTC chair. I also have a full video on this as well, implementing policies like the right to repair, banning non-competes, preventing junk fees, and keeping bank overdraft and late fees at $5 and $8 respectively. Lastly, Biden also signed an executive order to restrict the transfer of sensitive and personal data to hostile foreign countries like China and Russia to protect our personal information. Biden's economic program investing in infrastructure, manufacturing, clean energy, empowering workers, and demanding the rich and corporations pay their fair share. All this took place under the cloud of high inflation and rising interest rates, which should have caused an economic collapse. Yet by late 2024, the United States has achieved what many experts thought impossible: the coveted soft landing, with inflation falling to around 3%, without a recession, unemployment near record lows, record new business application, and wage growth right behind inflation. However, individuals had mixed feelings about the economy, and I often don't think people reflected of the circumstances of record high interest rates set in record time into our opinion of how he handled the economy. But largely, because of classically poor Democratic marketing, this did not matter to most people, and Biden got killed in the polls because of the economy. The only thing worse was the border. We go over that next and explain the differences between Biden's and Trump's policies and why getting Mexico to pay $1.5 billion towards border security, Trump's own campaign promise, wasn't the only thing that Biden did that got left unsaid.